Do you want me to use this or just... Can you hear me? Or should I use this? I can use this, okay. Also wanted to ask you to come up if you like, or if you just want to do it yourselves, then that's fine. Okay, and if you've done it already, you can do it again, because I'll speak about some of the details. Well, I'm very thrilled that you're here. It's no honor for you, it's an honor for me, because we teamed up with the Italian consulate in Hong Kong and Macau to bring the Venus painting here. And it is a rare opportunity because it's one of the Renaissance paintings that can actually travel and leave Europe, leave Italy, leave the museum it belongs to come here. And so we took that opportunity to make a big fuss about one painting. And by saying that, I mean that we applied for knowledge exchange money from Hong Kong U, and with colleagues in the Fine Arts Department, we developed an education system to reach out to you, to reach out to Hong Kong U students, to school groups, to anybody really, and offer them the kind of event that you're experiencing now, but for school groups also to come during the day for an hour, for 45 minutes, whatever they can do. And just to learn more about everything we can, in our crazy mind, connect with a painting. And that's the Renaissance, antiquity, mythology, the Medici as patrons, Botticelli as a painter, scientific and artistic developments during that time period that go on into our time. So I'll give you a little bit of that. Stop if you have questions. This is completely informal. And I will just try to answer all your questions. So the nice thing about this one painting is that it gives us a key piece to dive into all these different directions. And that is because it's a Renaissance painting that represents a mythological figure. Until the Renaissance, and still throughout the Renaissance and later on, the church was the most important patron of the arts. They built these large buildings, they commissioned stained glass windows and paintings and sculpture and tapestry and silver and gold vessels for the altar and so on and so on. During the Renaissance, two things happened. It was a very peaceful and rich period, and so more money, I mean looking back, more money and time were invested into culture and education. So it was quite a good period. And actually the funny thing is, the other day, 2 weeks ago, I came back from a conference in the US, and on the flight I looked at Time magazine, and they listed in an article the periods that were important for their inventions over time. And the Renaissance figured quite prominently, and that's exactly why the Renaissance, especially for Europeans, is still so important, because, and I'll come back to that in a minute, so many things were started that are still very important, especially in education today. But during the Renaissance, with more private wealth and private patrons commissioning artists and different arts, a different kind of art production started, because these private individuals didn't necessarily commission religious art. Of course, the church remained very strong, but they would commission religious topics. And the idea there was to illustrate the Bible with pictures or stained glass windows, and to tell the story to a large majority of people who couldn't read. And so it was very important, for it was their way of communicating. And so the arts were very important. Now, during the Renaissance, with private individuals commissioning art, like the Medici in Florence, they would have commissioned a few religious pieces, because in large city palaces or country homes, they would often have a small altar or even a chapel, and decorate those rooms and places. But they were free, of course, to commission anything else as well. And that's how the different genres, the different styles developed. The Medici, for example, they commissioned a lot of portraits. And they developed an interest in mythology. Then later, landscapes were commissioned, and cityscapes, and genre paintings, and still lifes, and all these different art forms developed in Europe that were not typically commissioned by the church. You know the large church paintings that have a landscape in the background or so, but it's not about the landscape, as you know. The interesting thing about mythology is not just that it became a topic in art and it was reproduced or represented or visualized in sculpture and painting, but the interesting thing is to one extent that it's also based on a book, so there's actually parallel to the Bible. But mythologies are not religious, although the story includes several different gods. Venus is the goddess of beauty and love and fertility. Diana was the goddess of hunt, Mars the god of warfare, and so on and so on. And the other interesting fact is that the mythologies really originate in antiquity. So they are a very nice example of what the Renaissance is about. Renaissance means rebirth. And that doesn't just relate to this new energy during that time period with peace and money and new beginnings, but also the looking back to antiquity. So the time period we are concerned with is about 500 years ago, like Ming Dynasty here, and antiquity is about 2,000 years ago, like Han. And like these two periods in China, they were equally important in Europe. And it's interesting because 500 years ago, artists looked back to 2000, so they looked back 1,500 years ago to 2,000 years ago from now. And they knew quite a bit about the architecture because in Rome and Athens and some of these antique cities, quite a bit of architecture was still and is still today visible. And so in Renaissance buildings you often have the columns and the temple-like fronts and these architectural features that come directly from antiquity. One important discovery in Rome during the Renaissance was, or rediscovery, was the so-called Golden House of Nero, an Italian emperor from Roman emperor from antiquity, and his 50-year-old building was rediscovered, and that also, in a way, brought a new wave, at least of knowledge about antiquity. But many places were not known at the time. For example, Pompeii, and south of Naples, south of Rome, was devastated when the volcano Vesuvius there erupted in late antiquity and wasn't rediscovered until the 18th century. Now we know that it's full of antique visual representations and architecture and so on, quite a wealth, and there is actually a very interesting depiction of the birth of Venus. But one that Botticelli would not have known because it was basically only rediscovered more than 300 years late after him. But what is interesting that the artists during the Renaissance worked with the same text to illustrate mythological figures. So paintings like this one have different sources. The most important source is the text, so it's a translation from textual to visual source. And there were a few images, like I said, the one in Pompeii, he most definitely didn't know. But there were some sculptures. The Medicis actually had a large art collection, the one that basically then formed the founding collection of the Uffizi in Florence. And in their collection is the so-called Medici Venus. And that is a sculpture representing Venus, and it is 2,000 years old. So Botticelli may have known that example from antiquity. So that's the second source. The third source is quite definitely a female model that he was painting again and again and again. So he brings the two together, or the three even maybe. And he doesn't paint just one of the two or three. The source in a way that he's most concerned with is the text, because he doesn't paint a portrait of the female lady that sits for him. He paints something different and probably more beautiful, more supernatural, because he's representing the goddess of beauty and love. And I point that out because with some of the features, we had her here now for 2 months. And one of the stylistic features we always discuss is her body and her looks. Because she seems very tall, very slim, and some of the features seem almost wrong, as if Botticelli or his workshop, and I'll come to that in a minute, couldn't really, if they got it wrong. And those features are in particular her very long neck, her long fingers, her weak shoulders, slanting shoulders, weak shoulders, and in a way that she's very tall and slim. Well, all of these features are still seen in Europe as particularly beautiful. Even the long neck, the long fingers, and the weak shoulders are seen as particularly female. So, take it or not, but I think what he was trying to do is paint that female sitter, but maybe exaggerate some of these aspects to paint somebody who is representing in 1482 all of these aspects that are seen, or features that are seen as particularly beautiful. The other thing that's quite puzzling is her hair, because she has very light hair for an Italian goddess, or Greek goddess too. And of course it's very long, very wavy, curly hair. And that must have been seen as particularly desirable in 1482 as well. And he painted Venus in this way repeatedly. You know maybe the famous birth of Venus that I just quickly referred to before. So he painted the same young lady, and she looks very, very similar. And I'll compare the two in a minute. I just quickly wanted to tell you a little bit more about the way that artworks were commissioned and the way that Botticelli and others worked. So in Florence is a small town still today. There's about 350,000 people today. And you can imagine 530 years ago, there were, despite the newly gained riches like the Medici family, they were in banking and they were merchants and they did it very well. But there were not many families like that. And there weren't that many artists. And actually, Botticelli, looking back as an art historian, Botticelli was sort of lucky because he is one generation older than Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. So he didn't really have those as his competitors at the time. So that may have helped him in a way. I mean, not that he's not good, but you know, in a small town that mattered, of course. If there's one rich family and one able painter, it's almost like a natural relationship. And this relationship mattered because there was no art market, there were no galleries, there were no publications, there was of course no internet, there were basically no sources for artists or anybody else to present themselves, no platform whatsoever. And so the way that these artworks were produced is quite different from today, because there's no shopping around, going from gallery to gallery and you pick up what you like. No, these were done with contracts. The Medici family and Botticelli would meet up, they would set up a contract between two individuals, and they would decide on the size, the topic, the material, the delivery date, and the price. We don't know the contract for this painting, but most artworks, also sculpture and tapestries, were done in this way. And it was important because there was no real outlet. Very important for Botticelli, so he could finance his family and his workshop. And by workshop I mean, of course, pay for the materials and so on, but also pay for his people, because very, very few Renaissance paintings are done exclusively by the master painter. So that's why we often say Michelangelo workshop or Botticelli workshop, or sometimes people say just workshop of these masters. The reason for that is that there were apprentices and journeymen working with Botticelli, who was their master, also in an educational sense. There were no art schools, and so the apprenticeship that artists went through was very, very important. So typically boys at a young age of maybe 12 or 13 years would be signed up by their parents to work with Botticelli and start out with doing silly tasks, because they were the young boys. They would clean the workshop, keep the workshop, maybe grind the pigment, mix the paints, things like that. And then gradually they would learn life drawing, either after a human or a sculpture, and they would be more and more instructed by their master, and they would paint with their masters more and more and more. So they would basically really, it's all learning by doing, so they would train and get more and more involved. And so if we look at some of the paintings, and we have that in mind, we read them completely differently. Like with this painting, I can guarantee you Botticelli didn't paint the background. They would focus and divide up the labor in such a way that it would be economically sensible, and that as I said, the younger artists would gain more and more experience. So Botticelli probably only painted the face, maybe the hands, but he's responsible for the composition. And although this one isn't very challenging, for the larger compositions like the Birth of Venus, you see how it's a little more thinking that goes into laying out the canvas. And so it is important that these are in a way also practice pieces for the workshop. And workshops, if they were busy, they would do several paintings in parallel. And knowing that makes it actually a little difficult to know where she figures in the production line. She could have been done before the major canvas was painted. We believe strongly that they belong together because the Venus herself, she looks very similar in both representations, although she also looks quite different, and I'll come to that later. But also her very extravagant pose, her posture is quite extreme, when especially if she's seen like this. I think with the other depiction it makes more sense, and I explain it a little more. But it's this not exactly knowing whether maybe he painted this before to sketch out the individual figures in the larger canvas, or if the larger canvas that was then seen in the Medici's collection generated more interest in Venuses. And their collection wasn't open, the Medici's collection wasn't really open to the public, but they were the first family in town, and they had a lot of visitors, and they would want to show off, and they were in politics and money making, and you can imagine. So they did have some traffic at their home, and they used their arts to, represent themselves, establish their status, and so on. So if we compare the two, and you can do that if you want to come up, feel free. But I just highlight some of the differences, or where I think some of the things come from. So the differences are that our Venus is not completely naked. She's wearing lace on her upper body. She's wearing a pearl in her hair, and she has darker hair than the other Venus. The other Venus has even lighter hair. But let me come to the similarities first, because I think the posture, there are two reasons for the posture of our Venus. One is that painters in the Renaissance were trying very hard to represent a lifelike figure. During the Gothic times before, if you think of some of the church paintings or sculptures, the figures are very dead looking, and you have even their robes, they fall very straight, they really look like sculptures. During the Renaissance, by bringing movement into the body, artists wanted to represent a more lifelike figure. The second reason, I think, is if we compare the Venus on the seashell, we get some idea why she has this strong S-shaped body and why her feet are in this position. Because in the other depiction, she is standing on the knob of the seashell and she's balancing, and she is actually, if you go closer, you see that, or if you know the painting from the Uffizi, then you know, she is leaning into the wind. The male figure on the left is blowing at her. He's representing wind. So the larger composition, it makes more sense. Also, actually, her hair blows out much further. So she is really in a very easily read environment over there, and ours is more isolated. With regards to the production, of course, that canvas offers more different stages. So apprentices would probably also be involved in the background. Now the sea and the sky are a little more challenging to paint than the black background here, but still not terribly hard, and the trees on the right, not super challenging. But then the robes and the bodies and the whole composition, you see there are different stages, and then again the faces to make them lifelike and give them expression where the hardest to paint. The same production methods are also present in, for example, in tapestry weaving or in sculpture. They were often workshop productions, and the master would do the faces and in weaving and in sculpture, but somebody else would be, or others would be much involved in the whole background and secondary surfaces. Two things are very important in artistic development in Europe at the time. One is the lifelike painting, and I want to compare this a little bit to Chinese painting because then it becomes very, very clear. The lifelike painting that also includes representing a three-dimensional body, and therewith shadowing, and the second theme is linear European perspective. So the representing the body in the round, as we say, has a lot to do with the light source and shadowing and creating this round look. And that's created quite a bit with the different coloring. So you can see in our example, the light comes from the right, and her proper left, her own left side, is a lot lighter than the other side. You see, especially on her legs or her arm, is quite a different. And then actually her feet are casting shadows. And that's something that became very much used in Europe at the time, but as a way of representing or thinking that was still quite or completely unknown really in China during the 18th century. We know from the few European artists, they were basically Jesuit missionaries at Chalmon's court, and they worked there like Atelier or Castillo and some of the really famous painters in Beijing. They worked there alongside with Chinese painters, and they had this discussion about painting styles because they were trained in Europe, came to China, and admittedly became the Europeans, they became more and more Chinese. But one of the techniques that some of them dropped, at least in many representations, was the shadowing, because Chinese connoisseurs and Chinese artists didn't see the need for having a dark, unattractive area next to trees, elements, you have it, all these different living creatures. And so it was discussed at the time and not quite known or not really respected or accepted at the time. The other thing, perspective, very, very different in China. As you know, Chinese paintings have a vertical perspective. If you think of scroll paintings, the further away, the higher up on the canvas, on the scroll. The bottom of the scroll is nearest to us. So Chinese paintings are basically read this way, the distance is up. And European paintings go in, so they are what we call linear or horizontal, and Chinese paintings or East Asian paintings are vertical. And in Europe, that really started during the Renaissance, and it's not at all visible in this canvas. It's a little visible over there, but then in cityscapes and with more architectural buildings, it's very much emphasized at that time. And it is done in such a way that the artist establishes basically an eye-level baseline. And everything tapers to that line, from below and up, and from this, especially from the sides. And you see that a lot. I mean, there it doesn't show too well, but believe me, it shows a lot in other Renaissance paintings and since then. And of course, that's also a technique that's quite different from Chinese painting, because they still today, modern painters who paint traditional watercolor scrolls often use this very vertical, traditional Chinese method. The other thing that is very different are the colors of the paints themselves. During the Renaissance, painters still painted with tempera paints, that's basically pigment and egg. So they are very natural paints that last a long time, as you can see, or oil paints, but not so much watercolor. And there are very different compositional strategies almost. And one thing, and it's, as I told you, I'll come back to her dress, in inverted commas, her lace, is a very interesting example, because tempera paints are completely opaque. So unlike in Chinese watercolors, where you have these very subtle ways of overlaying the different paints, and you can somewhat see through, and work with that in mind. With tempera paints, the pigment is completely solid, completely opaque. So you apply it and everything below is gone. It's completely covered up. So that means painting a see-through anything, in this case a see-through fabric, like the lace, is quite a challenge, because he's representing the fabric and he's representing the skin below. So it is a way of basically painting every other thread so that you can still see through. And that may be one of the reasons why the lace is included here, because Botticelli could actually do that really, really well. And Botticelli was a little old-fashioned in the way that he continued to paint with tempera paints when other painters who probably trained later switched more easily to oil paints, or even trained to oil paints already. Now, the two aspects that I mentioned here, the lace and the sea-pearl, they may also come from portrait paintings. And one reason why I say that is because portrait painting became very popular. And this is not a portrait, right? This is a mythological depiction. But in portrait paintings, the sitters were often shown with their best garments, their richest jewelry, and sometimes with little details like books or silverware, or later Chinese porcelain and exotic things, in order to show their wealth and their worldly connections. And so if you think of Renaissance portraits, very lush velvet clothing, very nice, incredibly expensive lace, collars and shirts, jewelry, and so on. And I think the lace that would have been quite expensive may come from there. It could be another influence. Same with the sea pearl. The pearl, as you can see here on her mid-head, doesn't exist in the other painting. And you may want to argue that the pearl relates to the seashell, and that's an interesting connection. But the Venus over there isn't wearing it. So that may be one reason. The other reason may be that it relates to to jewelry, and of course pearls are still desirable and expensive and nice today. But at the time they were completely out of this world, especially in Europe, because they didn't really exist in Europe. So what a sea pearl thereby represents is a worldly and international connection to something that only the best connected and in a way the wealthiest could afford or could have access to in any way. And we know that the Medici were really among these people because about 100 years after this was painted, the Medici family became the largest and best known collector of Ming blue and white porcelain. So from Italy, their influence or their connections reached all the way to Canton, to Guangzhou. So they had access, they didn't travel there, but they knew people who could get the porcelain. And then actually that porcelain, I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm very interested in that personally. Then that porcelain actually became incredibly important for Europeans because they loved it so much. They had no idea what it was. They didn't know if it was a clay-based product or glass. And it initiated about 220 years of investigation, imitation, manipulation to find out what it was. And then they finally found the kaolin clay and fire-tile paste porcelain in Europe in 1708 for the first time. So by that time, here people knew for about 1,000 years how to do it. So even hard paste, and I'm not talking about earthenware, but true, what we call true porcelain. But to go back to the painting, I think the sea pearl is one of these attributes that, like the porcelain, shows some of these connections. And the Medici were very well connected, and they were one of these families. Now, during the Renaissance, there were more and more of these connections. And as I said, there were more and more developments altogether. So many of the European universities were founded during the Renaissance. They go back 500-600 years. And that's really an interesting sign that there was the idea for a more accessible, more universal education. Then the apprenticeship system that I described still exists today. The idea that a young, maybe not quite 12 or 13 today, but that a young adult would do an apprenticeship and work with a company or in a workshop, and today they also go to college at the same time. But the idea to learn on the job rather than go to university, do a lot of theory, and then enter the field and then learn on the job, actually. Not that I want to disappoint anyone, but we'll see. But that is something that's still very much alive today. And then, of course, the artistic training. Live drawing is still the basis for so many different professions. I mean, middle school, children learn it first, I guess, then high school, then if you study architecture, design, or even conservation. The idea to train the eye by doing chalk or pencil drawings and to go from there is still basic to all of these different professions, even though you later on only do drawings in CAD and you only sit on a computer. But the idea to train the eye, to train the skill of your hand skills is still very common today. The other thing that if I stretch this topic a little further, that's represented is of course the human body and the Renaissance fascination in a way with the human body. They studied medicine, they studied the bone structure, the body a lot more than before. So not just artists in order to depict a lifelike figure, but also some true scientists would study our own health and body much, much more. And so that's another thing, of course, that we still do today, but it's one of these themes that continues. Do you have any questions?
It's actually quite a silly question, I have to say. Why is she not so sad? She's supposed to be the goddess of love, yes?
That's interesting. It's interesting to me because people have they see different emotions. Some think she looks indifferent, some think she looks just so neutral or sad, or nobody has said happy yet. So, and there may be two reasons for that. One, I mean, I don't see the sadness, but it doesn't matter. I will try to. I think the two reasons are, one is she has, to some extent, quite a typical Renaissance face. Faces like hers are depicted repeatedly, so it's not quite unique to her. The other thing that I think may explain a more neutral expression is that if we think about the birth of Venus, she's basically, by representing purity and beauty, she's also in a way representing the newly born. And I know that is a little difficult because she's 6.5 feet tall. But if you think about the mythology and the topic, then she's basically a baby. So maybe the more expressionless or neutral look is to do with that. It doesn't explain the sadness.
Thank you very much, and sorry I came a little late, so I missed the early part. I have two questions on the background, and the first one was you said that it was probably done by the workshop, and I just wondered if that was such a big job to do the background. How much of a task was that? And the second one was related to the colour of it, because it's quite a black, dark, heavy kind of colour, which sort of contrasts with the idea of lightness, purity, and in particular with the more uplifting sort of azure blue there. I just wondered.
And I think actually the original is even better than our reproduction. And when I said the background is not painted by Botticelli, I meant not by the master but by his workshop. So somebody who was able to paint a solid black, easy to achieve background. So it didn't require a better skilled master painter. But that said, it was part of this education program of basically painting more and more difficult areas. Now, why it's solid black, I'm not entirely sure. There are 2 or 3 representations like that. And I think it isolates her from the birth of Venus theme, so she's just Venus, and she's seen in a more neutral, boring context. But also, in some ways, I think she's more seen as a three-dimensional figure, and to me, she really looks like a sculpture thereby, because she's so isolated and on this side background. But I'm not entirely sure why he represented her like that. Sometimes portraits are done with very uniform backgrounds. They are not very. Sometimes they show the interior, but sometimes they are just almost like a studio shot. So I don't really have an answer for why he picked or why the workshop decided on this style black.
So was it a commissioned piece or was it just a practice? How do we know that this was a commissioned piece?
Well, we don't have the contract for this one, as I said. So it's a good question. I think most of the paintings, almost all paintings, were commissioned. And we know, of course, that many artists, little known for Botticelli though, but for Michelangelo, for example, Da Vinci did a lot of drawings. So I think to just get a basic idea, they would have selected a quicker and cheaper medium and not go to the very end by painting in all the facial features and really finishing the canvas to that extent. But we don't know the early provenance, the early history of ownership for this painting. We assume that she was commissioned also by the Medici or by their circles, but we don't know for sure.
Did Botticelli use a human as a model in both cases?
Yeah.
The same model?
Yes. Yeah, he used the same model in both of these cases and in several other cases, always the same young lady. And there are some, I mean, I don't know if you read some of the press around this. There are some theories as to who it was. Simonetta, a young lady in Florence who was a little bit like a Tatler girl, a socialite who was very beautiful, very connected, married very young, unfortunately died at 22, but was very much in these Medici circles, and Botticelli knew her. And he, if this is true, I never told the press this because I really only work with facts. But it is a nice story, and it could be true. There are some indications that this is the story. But in any case, if it was this young lady or another one, he did paint her repeatedly, and not just as a Venus. Also, his very famous Minerva painting shows her. So she is his muse and model, rather than Venus or Minerva or any other person. And he also most probably did a true portrait of her. Because we know a portrait style painting of her that doesn't really seem to be a goddess or any other representation.
You talked about all those exaggeration of the figure, and is it pronounced when you compare it with other paintings of the same model?
I think the representations of her always differ a little bit. I would even argue that our Venus is slightly taller looking than that Venus. And so the features are just a little different, not just the hair. And in the other representation, she's always shown a little different, and also dressed. I mean, she's not always naked or just wearing lace. So the representations that we know that are done after the same female sitter, whoever she was, are always a little different.
So I'm wondering, is there any special intention behind those differences? As in, why does it portray it differently?
I don't think so. I think he was just painting different paintings, and he happened to use the same model. And he's not painting her, right? So he's painting Venus and Minerva. And so she always comes out a little different.
One more question. So all these Renaissance period paintings are all about the god or church-related, religious-related topics. So there's not until the Impressionism time that we have this kind of daily life painting, right?
It starts developing at this moment in time. So yeah, you still have predominantly religious paintings, some mythology, some portraits. Landscapes become very big in the 17th century. And then the daily life scenes that we call genre scenes, these village scenes, tavern scenes, if you think of Netherlandish painting, also 17th century, hugely popular in the 18th century. So long before the Impressionists, but they pick up all these styles and they just continue, basically. Yeah. And still life is very popular in the 17th century, 18th century. Landscapes, cityscapes, seascapes, all around that time. What differs a little bit, and with regards to our beauty theme here, the representation of people and the aesthetics changed completely. If you think of Baroque painting, the putti, the people, they are all quite touchy. And so the idea, I think, of what represents beauty changes over time. So she's a little bit more like a 20th century model or 21st century model, right? She's very tall, very slim. So a little bit like the fashion people that we see on TV. But there are these so this was 530 years ago, but then there are these in-between times when other aspects, maybe a better nursed baby or so, were seen as something prosperous and beautiful.
Right, if there are no more further questions, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Ross for his generous sharing of knowledge. And, well, we originally planned to have a sharing session, but I think we only have 10 more minutes, right? Dr. North? Are you sure? Because actually the regular hour of this museum closes at 6 o'clock, and we really appreciate Dr. North and his team to stay behind and open this museum just for us. And so, well, do you guys want to look at the painting and the details? If so, maybe if you don't have the urge of doing the sharing this time, maybe we could leave it to at our next gathering. Our next gathering will be in February. Okay? Alright, so please. And may I invite Dr. North to share with us the upcoming events and what we could anticipate to see in this museum?
Thank you. A little bit of advertising. You want the advertising break before the viewing. We're just installing a large Chinese textile exhibition next door that will open tomorrow afternoon. And it's an exhibition of embroidered costumes, baby carriers, accessories from Chinese minorities, mostly from the southwest. So the Miao people, Yi, Dong, all of these tribes or groups that still continue to live and wear, at least at communal festivals and marriages and so on, these very richly embroidered costumes. So that will open tomorrow for 2 months, and we do a similar education program around that. Especially, I hope that we'll attract school groups again to basically tell them about this culture that, of course, with modernization is unfortunately fading away. But we have an impressive array, I think, of colors and techniques and costumes here. So come back and talk about us. And we have those tours and lectures around that exhibition as well, mostly in January. Because unfortunately the period is it seems somewhat shortened through the Christmas break, and then we cover Chinese New Year, but of course for us these are